My name is Andi Polk. I am 44 years old, and until 6 months ago I was a pediatric nurse at Vanderbilt Children's Hospital in Nashville. After 3 years of caring for my mother-in-law through lung cancer, I bought a lake house on Douglas Lake, with every cent of my savings to find the kind of silence that doesn't feel like a waiting room. The silence is the first thing that hits me. It is too heavy. It presses against my eardrums like a physical weight, thick and suffocating. Where is the rhythmic wheeze of the oxygen concentrator? Where is the sharp electronic chirp of the heart monitor, warning me that the levels are dipping again? My hands are twitching. I keep looking down at my palms, expecting to see a syringe or a morphine patch. My skin feels tight, buzzing with a phantom adrenaline that has nowhere to go. I am standing on the edge of the wooden dock, and the air smells like nothing. No antiseptic, no bleach, no dying lilies in a plastic vase, just a vast, terrifying emptiness. Then a sound breaks through, a soft, wet slap against wood. I flinch my shoulders, hitting my ears before I realize it is just the lake. The water is hitting the pilings. It is a slow, messy rhythm that does not care about dosage, schedules, or vitals. My breath finally hitches and breaks. I am alone. For the first time in over 1,000 days, no one is calling my name. No one is fading away under my watch. I am Andi, and there is nothing I have to do but exist. I walk to the end of the dock and let my knees give out. The wood is warm from the Tennessee sun, rough and honest under my calloused fingers. I am 44 and I feel like 100. I feel like a ghost that accidentally bought a house. My hand brushes against the main, piling the thick timber that holds the dock to the earth. There is something there. I run my thumb over it, 4 letters carved deep into the grain, weathered by decades of lake spray. 2 letters, a plus sign, and 2 more. W.M plus A.P. I don't look closer. I don't want to know who they were or what they thought they were building. To me, it is just old graffiti on a house I paid $520,000 to own. I close my eyes and try to listen to the water, but the hospital sounds are still playing on a loop in the back of my skull. Is this freedom? Or is it just loneliness wearing a different dress? I go back inside to the kitchen. The linoleum is old, a pale yellow that reminds me of the hallways at Vanderbilt. I start on the first box, the one labeled Andi's stuff. It is a small box. After a divorce and 3 years of caregiving, my life fits into a singular carton of cardboard. I pull out my stethoscope. The cold metal feels like a lead weight in my hand. The last time I used it, I was listening to Jean's heart at 3 in the morning. I was listening to the gaps between the beats getting longer and longer until there was only the sound of my own blood rushing through my ears. I open the kitchen drawer and tuck the stethoscope into the far back corner. I slide the drawer shut. I am not a nurse today. I am just a woman on a lake. The phone rings. The sound is like a gunshot in the quiet house. I look at the screen and the knot in my stomach tightens. It is my mother, Marlene. I waited 10 seconds before answering. Andrea Marlene said, her voice full of that bright southern charm that always felt like a velvet glove over a fist. Baby girl, I have been thinking. That big old house all by yourself. It is not safe. A woman alone on a lake. Mom, I am fine, I said. I have only been here 3 days. I just got the power turned over to my name. Well, that is exactly why, Marlene replied. You need family around you. I talked to your Aunt Patty. We are coming tomorrow. Coming to visit? I asked. My hand was already gripping the edge of the counter. Coming to stay, Andrea, Marlene said. The sweetness was gone, now replaced by that flat maternal authority she had used on me since I was 11. You have 3 bedrooms. Patty and I will take the one facing the water. We already packed the car. Mom, I bought this place to be alone, I said. I am not ready for guests. This is my house. Marlene was silent for 3 seconds. I should have realized then why she went quiet when I first told her the house was on Douglas Lake. I should have heard the gears turning. If you do not like it, you can always find somewhere else to live, Marlene said. Her voice was small and cold now. But family sticks together. See you tomorrow, baby girl. She hung up. I stood in my kitchen, and the silence of the lake felt like a trap. She told me I could find somewhere else to live. In a house I just bought with my life savings. I felt my jaw grinding, the familiar ache of it, returning. I had spent my life preparing rooms for people. I had spent my life making sure everyone else was comfortable while I slept on the floor or in a plastic chair by a hospital bed. I walked to the basement door. I needed to prepare the guest room because that is what I do. I am a caregiver. I do not know how to be anything else. The basement stairs groaned under my feet. The air down here was different, smelling of damp cedar and old boat engines. I saw the workbench against the wall covered in rusted fishing tackle and empty mason jars. There was a large oak cabinet pushed into the far corner, a massive piece of furniture that looked like it had been there since the house was built. The bottom was swollen from years of moisture, the dark wood heavy and stubborn. I needed to move it to make room for Marlene's suitcases. I went to the workbench and found an old pry bar. I wedged it under the left side of the cabinet and threw my weight against it. My muscles burned. It was a familiar pain, the kind you get from rolling a 180-pound patient over to change the sheets. I moved the cabinet an inch. Then another. I rocked it back and forth, using the rhythm of my own breath to fight the weight of the wood. The cabinet scraped across the concrete floor, a harsh screaming sound that echoed in the empty room. I pulled one last time and the cabinet lurched forward, clearing 18 inches of space from the wall. Something fell. It was a soft sound, like a secret being whispered. I looked down. A manila folder was lying on the floor, half covered in a decade of dust. It had been tucked into a gap between the back of the cabinet and the unfinished pine wall. I reached down and picked it up. The paper was yellowed, the edges brittle. On the front there was handwriting I recognized instantly. It was the same handwriting that used to be on the birthday cards I got every year until I was 29. It was my grandmother's script. Willa Munn. For Andrea, the note read, "Do not give to Marlene." My hand started to shake. I sat down on the cold concrete floor, the folder resting on my thighs. I could hear the wind picking up outside, whistling through the small basement windows, but my entire world was focused on that single line of blue ink. Do not give to Marlene. I opened the folder. The first thing I saw was a legal document, Last Will and Testament of Willa June Munn. I traced the date. 18 years ago, 3 years before she passed away. I read the words and the air left my lungs. I hereby bequeath my residence at Douglas Lake, Jefferson County, Tennessee, together with the sum of $50,000 held in trust at First Bank of Dandridge to my granddaughter, Andrea Mae Polk. I read it again, and a third time. My eyes skipped to the legal description of the property. The parcel number. The acreage. I pulled out my phone with trembling fingers and opened the digital copies of my closing papers. The numbers matched. Every single one of them. My grandmother had left me this house. 18 years ago, she had signed a paper saying this place was mine. But when she died, my mother had told me there was nothing. Marlene had told me the house had to be sold to pay off debts. She had told me Grandma Willa had died penniless and that I should be grateful she was handling the mess. I looked at the folder. Marlene had sold this house 14 years ago for $280,000. She had pocketed the money, and 3 days ago I had paid $520,000 to buy it back from a developer. I had not bought a new life. I had accidentally bought back my own stolen inheritance. I saw a smaller envelope inside the folder. It was sealed with old wax, the red disc cracked but still holding. Willa's handwriting was on this one too. "Andi, open when you are ready." I could not open it. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I clutched the folder to my chest and leaned my head back against the cold oak cabinet. From upstairs, I heard the sound of a car pulling into the driveway, tires crunching on gravel, car doors slamming shut. Andrea Marlene shouted, "We are here. Come help your Aunt Patty with these bags." I sat in the dark of the basement, the floorboards creaking above me as my mother walked into the kitchen. The woman who had lied to me for 15 years was standing in the house she had stolen from me. I looked at the folder. I looked at the stairs. I did not answer. I stayed in the silence, and for the first time in my life, I let her wait. I moved through the upstairs hallway, like a stranger in my own skin, my fingers white from gripping the manila folder against my ribs. Below me, the house was no longer silent. It was full of the sharp, rhythmic clacking of my mother's heels on the hardwood, and the heavy dragging sound of suitcases being hauled across the threshold. I reached my bedroom and slid the deadbolt home. It was the first time I had ever locked a door against my mother. The click of the metal felt like a gunshot, final and irreversible. I sat on the edge of my bed, the mattress still smelling of the plastic wrap it had arrived in only 72 hours ago. My hands were shaking as I spread the papers out on the duvet. The legal-size sheets were crisp yellowed only at the very edges, holding the weight of 18 years of secrets. I looked at the signature at the bottom. Willa June Munn. My grandmother. Her handwriting was steady, a sharp contrast to the way I remembered her hands in those final months, gnarled and trembling like winter branches. The document was notarized by a man named Gerald Hobbs. I stared at his embossed seal until the golden light of the Tennessee sunset began to fade. This will had been signed 3 years before she died. It was clear. It was deliberate. I hereby bequeath my residence at Douglas Lake to my granddaughter Andrea May Polk for her kindness, her presence, and her love when others chose absence. Those words hit me harder than the theft of the house itself. When others chose absence, she was talking about Marlene. My mother hadn't visited her own mother in 4 years before the end. She had stayed in Nashville busy with her real estate listings and her social circles, while I spent every Saturday of my 20s driving 2 hours east to sit by a fading woman who smelled of peppermint and cedar. I had given up my weekends, my sleep, and eventually, my first marriage to be the one who stayed. And all that time, Willa had seen it. She had tried to pay me back with the only thing she had left, the sum of $50,000 held in trust at First Bank of Dandridge. I looked at that line until the words blurred. I had never seen a cent of that money. 15 years ago, when Marlene told me there was nothing, I had believed her, because a daughter is supposed to believe her mother. I had spent 15 years living paycheck to paycheck as a pediatric nurse working double shifts at Vanderbilt to save for a retirement I thought I would never see. I had poured my life into other people's children and other people's deaths while my mother was sitting on a mountain of money that belonged to me. There was a second envelope in the folder still sealed with that brittle red wax. Willa's small, careful script said I should open it when I was ready. I touched the wax, felt the cold ridge of it under my thumb, but I couldn't break it. Not yet. My heart was already hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I gathered the papers and slid them under my mattress, smoothing the sheets as if I could hide the truth from the very floorboards of the room. The next morning, the kitchen smelled of White Diamond's perfume and burnt toast. Marlene was already there, wearing a silk robe that cost more than my monthly grocery budget, moving through the space with an ease that made my stomach turn. I stood in the doorway and watched her. She didn't ask where the mugs were. She didn't hunt for the coffee filters. She reached into the far left cabinet and pulled out 2 ceramic cups without a moment of hesitation. "You found everything okay?" I said, my voice sounding thin even to my own ears. Marlene didn't turn around. She was busy pouring cream into her coffee. "Oh, honey, kitchens are kitchens." "They are all the same," she said. I watched her hand reach for the small drawer next to the stove. She pulled it open and grabbed the sugar bowl. Most people would have checked the pantry first. Most people would have looked for the silverware drawer. But Marlene knew exactly where the sugar was. I felt a cold flush of realization. She wasn't just guessing. She knew this house because she had grown up in it. She knew it because she had spent her childhood in these rooms before she decided they weren't grand enough for the life she wanted to live in the city. "Lucky guess," I whispered. Marlene paused for a single second, her spoon hovering over her cup. The silence in the kitchen grew heavy, thick with the smell of her perfume and the distant sound of the lake lapping at the shore. She didn't look at me. She just gave a sharp, bright laugh and turned around her face, a mask of practiced southern charm. I am a real estate agent, Andrea. I know how houses are built. It is all about the flow, she said. I sat at the table and pulled out my phone, my fingers flying over the screen. I pulled up the Jefferson County property records. It took me less than 5 minutes to find the chain of title. 14 years ago, the house had been sold by Marlene Roy Polk, acting as the sole heir of the Willa Munn estate. The sale price had been $280,000. The math was a physical pain in my chest. $280,000 pocketed by my mother. Another $240,000 in appreciation that I had just paid for with my own blood and sweat. She had sold my inheritance and then watched me buy it back at a premium, and she hadn't said a single word. She had walked into this house yesterday and told me it wasn't safe for me to be alone, all while standing on the floor she had stolen from me. Throughout the afternoon, I followed her like a shadow. I watched her run her hand along the banister as she went upstairs, her fingers lingering on the wood as if she were greeting an old friend. I heard her telling my Aunt Patty that the view was better from the second bedroom than it always had been. Patty stayed quiet, her eyes glued to her knitting, her shoulders hunched as if she were waiting for a blow to land. The most damning moment came just before dinner. I was in the living room when I saw Marlene walk straight to the pantry. She didn't look for food. She reached behind the door and turned the hidden handle that led to the basement stairs. The basement door in this house is camouflaged, built into the wainscoting, so it looks like part of the wall. Unless you know it is there, you would walk right past it. Marlene didn't even slow down. She opened it and stepped into the dark. I stood at the top of the stairs, my heart thundering. I heard her moving around below, the sound of things being shifted. Then she came back up, her face flushed, her eyes searching mine with a sudden sharp intensity. "That old storage closet in the basement," she said, her voice a bit too loud. "It is a mess, Andrea. You really should let me help you clear out the junk down there." I felt the air go cold in my lungs. I hadn't told her there was a storage closet in the basement. I hadn't mentioned the oak cabinet or the space behind it. "I didn't say there was a storage closet," I said. Marlene didn't flinch. "All old cabinets in basements are storage closets, baby girl. Don't be so sensitive." She walked past me, the scent of her white diamonds trailing in the air like an insult. I stood there for a long time looking at the hidden door. She was here because of the folder. She had realized far too late that she had left a piece of evidence behind 18 years ago. And she had come back to Douglas Lake to burn it. Before I could find it, I waited until they were both in bed, the house settling into the deep, uneasy quiet of the woods. I didn't go to sleep. I went to my closet and pulled out my car keys. I thought about the words in Willa's will. For her kindness, her presence, and her love, tomorrow morning I wasn't going to be the good daughter. I wasn't going to be the caregiver who made everyone else comfortable. I was going to drive into Dandridge. I was going to find a lawyer, and I was going to start the fire that would burn my mother's life to the ground. For the first time in 44 years, I wasn't preparing a room for someone else. I was preparing a war. The drive into Dandridge took 20 minutes, but it felt like a journey across a border I could never recross. The morning air was already thick with Tennessee humidity, a heavy blanket that smelled of damp earth and wood smoke. I parked my car on Main Street right across from a hardware store, where the scent of fertilizer and cut lumber drifted out to the sidewalk. Pruitt and Associates sat on the second floor of a brick building that looked like it had been standing since the Civil War. I climbed the narrow wooden stairs, the rhythmic creak of each step echoing in the quiet stairwell like a slow heartbeat. Vern Pruitt's office smelled of old paper, leather bindings, and black coffee that had been sitting in the pot for too long. He was a man in his late 50s with slow, deliberate movements and eyes that seemed to read the space between your words. He didn't rush me. He pointed to a chair that felt like it had been molded to the shape of 1,000 worried clients before me. I handed him the manila folder, my fingers lingering on the yellowed edges before I finally let go. Vern put on his glasses and began to read, his thumb tracing the embossed seal of the notary. "This is a notarized last will and testament," he said, his voice a low, gravelly drawl. "Gerald Hobbs stamped it." I knew Gerald. He was a meticulous man, the kind who wouldn't put his name on a document unless every single letter was in its proper place. Vern looked up, his gaze settling on mine with a weight that made me sit straighter. "Where did you get this, Andrea?" "I found it behind an oak cabinet in my grandmother's basement," I told him. "My mother hid it. Or, my grandmother hid it from her. I am not sure which is worse." Vern took off his glasses and leaned back the leather chair, groaning under his weight. "Your grandmother was Willa Munn. My father handled some of her affairs years ago. I remember when she passed. The will that went through probate back then left everything to your mother, Marlene. I reviewed it myself. My father did too. Then either my grandmother changed her mind in the 6 months before she died, or my mother changed the will," I said. Vern nodded slowly, his fingers tapping a steady rhythm on the desk. "Tennessee law is very specific about this. Under the state code for will contests, we have a window to challenge a probated will. If there is evidence of fraud, usually that window is short, but there is a rule regarding the discovery of the truth. Since you only found this document this week, the clock starts now. We have 2 years from the moment of discovery to set things right." He paused, looking back at the document. Gerald Hobbs notarized this one, but I remember the name on the probated file. It was a man named Dale Puckett from over in Newmarket. Gerald was Willa's regular notary for 30 years. Why she would suddenly drive 20 miles to a stranger to sign a new will that cut out her favorite granddaughter is a question that doesn't have a clean answer. Vern's expression hardened, a spark of professional indignation lighting his eyes. "My father filed that probate. If your mother deceived him with a forged document, then my family name is attached to a theft. I don't take kindly to that." The conversation shifted to the reality of what had been taken. Vern pulled out a yellow legal pad and began to scribble numbers, the scratch of his pen, the only sound in the room. "If we prove this will is the authentic one, the court can impose what is called a constructive trust," he explained. "It means that legally Marlene never owned that property. Every dollar she received from the sale 14 years ago she was merely holding for you. With the statutory interest rate in Tennessee that $280,000 has grown, she would owe you roughly $430,000 just for the house. And the trust at First Bank," I added. $50,000 that disappeared. Vern added that to his tally. "We are looking at over $500,000, plus potential civil conspiracy charges, if we can prove someone helped her. You mentioned your Aunt Patty received a large sum after the sale. That is a paper trail that leads straight to a motive for silence." Vern leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Do not confront her yet. Tennessee is a one-party consent state, which means you can record your conversations with her as long as you are part of the talk. Do not provoke her. Do not accuse her. Just let her talk. Let her weave her own noose." I left his office with a stack of legal brochures and a feeling of cold, sharp clarity. The drive back to Douglas Lake felt different. I wasn't looking at the scenery anymore. I was looking at a crime scene. I pulled over at a mailbox with the name Cobb painted in fading white letters. Neva Cobb's house was a small, tidy place with a porch that overlooked the water. She was standing there before I even cut the engine, a thin woman with white hair and eyes that looked like they had seen every storm the lake had to offer. "You look like her," Neva said as I climbed the porch steps. "Same jawline, same hands. Willa always said you were the only one who truly had her spirit." "You knew her well?" I asked. "I knew her for 40 years, Neva replied, her voice steady and unsentimental. "I watched her house get sold out from under her memory by a daughter who couldn't be bothered to visit when it mattered. I watched 3 different families live in those rooms while you were off being a nurse in Nashville. I have been waiting for you to come home, Andrea." I showed her the folder. Neva didn't need to read it. She just touched the cover with a trembling hand. "She told me she did this," the old woman whispered. "She told me Marlene would try to destroy the truth, so she hid one copy in the house where only a person who cared enough to clean would find it. But she was a smart woman, your grandmother. She knew one copy might not be enough." "You have been holding a backup for 18 years, I asked, my heart skipping a beat. Not a copy of the will, Neva said, looking toward the lake. Something else. Something she said you would need if the papers weren't enough to stop Marlene. She gave me a box and told me to keep it until you were ready to fight. I wanted to see if you had the fire in you before I gave it up. Seeing you here with that look in your eyes, I reckon you are ready. She didn't give me the box then. She told me to go home and act like nothing had changed. She told me to listen to the house and wait for the right moment. I walked back to my car, the weight of Willa's hidden arsenal feeling heavier than the $500,000 Marlene owed me. I had a lawyer, I had a witness, and somewhere in Neva's house I had a weapon my grandmother had forged 18 years ago. I drove back to my stolen home, ready to play the part of the dutiful daughter one last time. For the first time in my life, I wasn't just surviving. I was hunting. The light in Vern Pruitt's office was a pale, dusty yellow, the kind that makes everything look like an old photograph. I sat there for hours, my eyes burning from the fine print on the county records Vern had pulled. We were following the life of this house, tracing it like a pulse that had flatlined, and then been shocked back into existence by my own signature on a closing document. The chain of title was a map of a betrayal that had been drawn 14 years ago and hidden in plain sight. Willa Munn had owned the lake house for 47 years, a lifetime of summer mornings and wood smoke. Upon her death, the probate file showed the property transferred to Marlene Roy Polk, described as the sole heir. Marlene had used her own real estate license to list it, a move that felt efficient and cold, and sold it for $280,000 to a couple named Donald and Terry Haig. They held on to it for 6 years before selling it to Ridgeline Development for $385,000. The developers did the heavy lifting, replacing the dock and gutting the kitchen, and then they listed it for $545,000. I had negotiated them down to $520,000, thinking I was getting a deal. The paper felt like a dried leaf in my hands as I traced the numbers with my finger. $520,000. I had spent my entire adult life working toward that amount of money, and I had handed it over to buy back something that should have been given to me in a velvet box 18 years ago. Vern leaned over the desk, his glasses sliding down his nose. The will filed in probate is the real problem, Andi. It was dated 6 months after the one you found in the basement. It is typed formal and leaves every single asset to your mother. No mention of you. No mention of the $50,000 trust. And look at the notary. He pointed to a name I didn't recognize. Dale Puckett. He was a notary from Newmarket who specialized in quick real estate closings. He passed away 4 years after this was signed. No one alive can tell us if Willa ever stood in his office. I held a photocopy of that probated will next to the original one I'd found. The signature on the probate document was close, a very good imitation. But the letter W was all wrong. My grandmother had a sharp, jagged way of starting her name like a mountain peak. The signature Marlene had filed was soft and round. It was a signature drawn by someone who was trying to be careful, not someone who was signing their name for the 10,000th time. Vern's face was grim as he pulled another set of documents from a blue folder. The money didn't just stay in the house, he said. The $280,000 from the sale went straight into your mother's personal checking account. 6 months later, there was a wire transfer for exactly $80,000 to Patricia Ann Munn. I felt a cold sensation in the back of my neck, Patty's share. It was the price of her silence, I whispered. It looks that way, Vern replied, his pen scratching against a yellow legal pad. And then there is the trust. $50,000 at First Bank of Dandridge. Records show Marlene closed that account 2 months after probate was granted. She claimed it as the sole heir and walked out with the cash. The math was a heavy weight in my chest. $280,000 from the house and $50,000 from the trust. $330,000 stolen from a 29-year-old nurse who was too busy grieving her grandmother to ask for a copy of a will. Marlene had net roughly $250,000 after paying off Patty, and over 14 years she had lived on it. Vern's investigation showed she had less than $25,000 left in her accounts. She wasn't moving in with me to be close to family. She was moving in because the money had finally run out. When I got back to the lake house that evening, the smell of white diamonds was thick enough to choke on. Marlene had invited her church group for what she called a housewarming, and my living room was filled with women I had never met. They were drinking from my glasses and sitting on my furniture. And Marlene was at the center of it all, playing the role of the devoted mother. "This is my daughter, Andrea," Marlene said, draped her arm around my shoulders and pulling me toward a woman in a floral dress. "She has been through so much. Poor thing. The burnout from her nursing job was just devastating. I told her, baby girl, Mum is here now. We are taking care of her." The woman looked at me with a pity that made my skin crawl. "You are so lucky to have Marlene," she said. "Some children just don't appreciate a mother's sacrifice." I didn't argue. I didn't pull away. I played the part of the fragile patient clearing plates and smiling politely while Marlene told the room how unstable I had been since Jean passed. She was building a fortress of witnesses, a narrative that would make me look like a delusional grieving woman if I ever tried to tell the truth. I looked over at Patty, who was standing by the bookshelf. She wasn't talking. She was staring at a photo of Willa on the dock, her hand pressed flat against her chest, as if she were trying to keep her heart from escaping. Her eyes were red, and when she noticed me watching, she immediately set the photo face down and walked toward the kitchen. The guilt was a physical thing in the room, a crack in Marlene's perfect world that was getting wider every day. I went up to my room and locked the door, the sound of the church lady's laughter muffled by the floorboards. I pulled the folder from under my mattress and thought about what Neva had told me, that Willa had left a box with something I would need when the papers alone were not enough. Tomorrow, the paper trail would lead deeper. Marlene had spent 15 years rewriting our history. But my grandmother had written the final chapter 18 years ago, and I was finally ready to read it out loud. I waited until the house settled into that uneasy, artificial quiet that had defined the last 9 days. Patty had retreated to her room early, her shoulders hunched as she avoided my eyes, leaving only the soft hum of the refrigerator and the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock to fill the kitchen. Marlene was sitting at the oak table, her manicured nails tapping a restless, confident pattern against her ceramic mug of decaf. The scent of her white diamonds perfume was a heavy floral fog in the small space, clashing with the clean smell of the lake air drifting through the open window. I sat across from her, the manila folder resting heavy on my lap beneath the table, my fingers tracing the brittle edges of the paper. I took a breath and placed the folder on the table between us. Marlene did not stop tapping her nails immediately, but her eyes dropped to the yellowed paper, and for a fraction of a second her entire body went perfectly still. It was the kind of stillness I had seen in the woods when a predator realizes it has been spotted. Then the mask of the doting mother slid back into place, and she took a slow, controlled sip of her coffee. "What is this, baby girl?" she asked, her voice light and musical. "I found this behind the oak cabinet in the basement," I said, my own voice sounding steady despite the drumming in my ears. "It is Grandma Willa's will. The real one." Marlene set her mug down with a deliberate click. "Andrea, your grandmother's affairs were settled through probate 15 years ago. Whatever you found is just old paper." She was confused at the end, poor thing. She wrote all kinds of things that were not legal. "This one says the house goes to me, Mum," I said, pushing the folder toward her. "This house. The one you told me Grandma left nothing from. It is notarized and dated 3 years before she passed. She was completely lucid when she signed this." "Notarized does not mean it was her final wish," Marlene replied, her voice dropping into that low instructional tone she used with children. "There was a newer will. The one the court accepted, the one that recognized the daughter who raised you alone after your father died. The one that left everything to you," I countered. "You did not visit her for 4 years before she died." "Not once. I was the one there every Saturday while you were in Nashville. She left me this house because I was the only one who showed up." Marlene's jaw worked, her teeth grinding behind closed lips. "Now, Andi, let us not be dramatic. I had my reasons for my absence. I was working to provide for this family. You have always had a tendency to see things through a very narrow lens." She leaned forward, her expression shifting into a look of weaponized compassion. You know what I think? I think you are having a mental break. I talked to your friend Margot. She told me you quit your job without a plan. You bought a house you cannot afford with savings you should have kept. You are living alone on a lake, making wild accusations against your own mother. Baby girl, I am worried about you. Maybe we should find a professional for you to talk to. Margot. My Margot. The one person I had called from this kitchen 3 days ago, the one who had told me to lock the door and say no. My mother had reached her, turned her into a source, another pair of eyes confirming the narrative that I was falling apart. The air in the kitchen seemed to thin. I had spent my life falling for this move, allowing her to twist my reality until I doubted my own memories. But the weight of the folder gave me an anchor. I realized then that she was never going to apologize. She was already building a narrative where I was the unstable one and she was the long-suffering savior. Let me see that, Marlene said, reaching for the folder. No, I said. I pulled the papers back toward me. It was the first time in 44 years I had said that word to her and meant it. Marlene's face changed. For a single second the charm evaporated, revealing a raw animal fear that made her look every bit of her 69 years. The fear told me more than a confession ever could. She knew the folder existed, and she was terrified that I held the power to undo everything she had built on that lie. Fine, Marlene said, standing up and smoothing her silk robe. Keep your little papers, but I want you to know that I did what was best for this family. Everything I did for us. This is how you repay me. By dragging up the past to hurt your mother. She walked out of the kitchen, her heels clicking sharply on the wood, and I heard her bedroom door slam. A few moments later, the muffled sound of her voice traveled through the floorboards. She was on the phone, her tone urgent and hushed. I sat alone at the table, the ticking clock, feeling louder than before. I turned my attention to the sealed letter from Willa that I had kept at the top of the stack. My thumb slid under the old wax seal, and the glue gave way with a dry, papery snap. The pages inside smelled of cedar and old memories. Willa's handwriting was smaller here, more careful, as if she were trying to fit a lifetime of truth into a few sheets of paper. The first line stopped my heart. Andi, if you are reading this, it means Marlene failed to find it first. I read the letter 3 times, my eyes blurring with tears that had nothing to do with the money. Willa confirmed there was never a second will. She wrote about the Saturday mornings we spent together, how I was the only person who sat with her and truly listened without checking a phone or asking for a check. She described how Marlene had harassed her for months about the house, laughing when Willa mentioned leaving it to me, telling her that love did not dictate inheritance. Willa had seen it all coming. She had hidden the will where Marlene would not look and had left a backup box with Neva. She wrote that she was sorry she was not strong enough to stop Marlene while she was alive, but she was leaving me the tools to do it after she was gone. This house was always yours, baby, the letter ended. Come home. I sat in the dark bedroom later that night. The letter folded carefully against my chest. Through the wall, I could hear Marlene snoring, a peaceful sound from a woman who had spent 15 years living on a stolen legacy. I felt a cold, hard resolve settle into my bones. The nurse who wanted peace was gone. The woman who wanted justice was finally awake. I picked up my phone and sent a text to Vern Pruitt. There is a safe deposit box at First Bank of Dandridge, I wrote. My grandmother left a key with a neighbour. We need to open it as soon as the bank opens tomorrow. I put the phone down and looked out at the black water of Douglas Lake. Willa had built a war chest from her deathbed, and I was finally ready to use it. No longer was I looking for an apology. I was looking for the deed to my home. The petition was filed on a Tuesday morning at the Jefferson County Courthouse. Vern Pruitt did not waste any time, his fingers moving with a clinical efficiency as he stamped the documents that would reopen my grandmother's estate. Standing in his office, I felt a strange surge of adrenaline, the kind I used to feel when a patient went into cardiac arrest, and every second mattered. We were no longer just gathering papers. We were declaring war. The process server arrived at the Lakehouse just after lunch. I was not there to see it, having stayed in Dandridge to review property tax records. But I heard the aftermath over the phone. Marlene called me 3 minutes after the man left the porch. Her voice was not the melodic honeyed drawl she used for her church friends. It was a sharp, jagged sound that reminded me of a blade scraping against a bone. "You sued me," she said, skipping any greeting. "You actually sat in a lawyer's office and sued your own mother." I gripped the edge of Vern's mahogany desk, my knuckles turning a dull white. "I filed a petition to reopen Grandma Willa's estate, Mom. It is about the truth." "This is insanity," Marlene hissed. And I could hear the rhythmic pacing of her heels on the hardwood floor of the kitchen. "You are having a complete breakdown, Andrea. Everyone can see it. The stress of losing Jean and your job has finally snapped your mind. You are imagining things that never happened." "I have the original will," I told her, my voice low and steady. "I have Grandma's handwriting. You have a forgery," she countered, and I could almost see her practiced wounded expression through the phone. "You made that up to steal from me. After everything I have given you, after every sacrifice I made to raise you alone, you are trying to take my home." "It was never your home," I said, but she had already hung up. My hands were shaking, a fine tremor that started in my fingertips and moved up my arms. It was not fear. It was the sudden, terrifying realization that she would never admit to what she had done. She would burn the world down before she confessed. Marlene did not collapse under the weight of the legal filing. Instead, she deployed her counteroffensive with the precision of a seasoned general. By Wednesday, the narrative in town had shifted. She called every church friend who had eaten her cookies and sat on my sofa, telling them with a breaking voice that I was suffering from a severe mental health crisis. She told them that my caregiver burnout had turned into a dangerous obsession with the past. By Thursday, she had hired an attorney from Morristown named Clint Eckert. He was known for being aggressive and expensive, exactly the kind of man a woman with a guilty conscience would want in her corner. He filed a formal response to our petition, claiming that the document I found in the basement was a crude forgery. He even went as far as to subpoena my medical records, looking for any evidence of instability during the years I spent caring for Jean. Vern managed to block the subpoena, but the damage was already being done. When I went into town to pick up groceries, the women from the church group looked away as I passed. They whispered behind their hands, their eyes full of a weaponized pity that Marlene had carefully planted. I was becoming the troubled daughter, and Marlene was the brave, heartbroken mother trying to save me from myself. Then came the blow that threatened to end our case before it ever reached a judge. Vern called me into his office on Friday morning, his expression grimmer than I had ever seen it. He had spent the day tracking the notaries. "We have a problem, Andi," he said, leaning back in his leather chair. "Gerald Hobbs, the man who notarized your copy of the will, is definitely deceased." I already knew that, but I hoped his records survived. They did not. A flood at the county clerk's office 6 years ago wiped out his entire ledger for that decade. I felt the air go cold in the room. "What about the other one?" "Dale Puckett." Vern shook his head. "He died 4 years after your grandmother, without a living notary to testify that they witnessed the signature. Your mother's attorney is arguing that your document is unverifiable. He is moving for a dismissal. He says the court should stick with the probated will, because it has already been the law for 15 years. We were losing. I could feel the ground slipping away the same way it had when my husband walked out, or when Jean's heart finally stopped. I had the truth in my hands, but the law was asking for a living witness, and they were all in the ground. The final betrayal happened on Saturday morning. I walked into the kitchen at the Lakehouse and found my Aunt Patty sitting at the table. Her bags were packed and sitting by the door. She would not look at me, her eyes fixed on a scratch in the wood of the table. "You are leaving?" I asked. "I cannot be in the middle of this anymore," Patty whispered. "It is too much, Andrea." "You are not in the middle, Patty. You are part of it," I said, my voice rising. "You took $80,000 to stay quiet while my mother stole my life." Patty flinched, her shoulders hunching as if she were trying to disappear. "I do not know what you are talking about. Your mother is a good person. She did what she thought was right for the family. She took care of us when your father died. She lied to me for 15 years, I said, standing between her and her bags. And you let her do it." "Marlene is my sister," Patty said, finally looking up. Her eyes were red and full of a desperate, terrified loyalty. "I cannot go against her. I will not." She picked up her bags and walked out the door without another word. 20 minutes later, Marlene's car followed her out of the driveway. They were both gone, headed back to Nashville, leaving me alone in the house that Marlene had already stripped of its peace. I sat on the kitchen floor, the silence of the lake pressing in from all sides. The house still smelled like Marlene's perfume. I was 44 years old alone, and being called a liar by the people who should have loved me most. My evidence was being challenged, my notaries were dead, and my only witness had chosen my mother's side. I looked up at the ceiling and felt the weight of every sacrifice I had ever made. I had given everything to these people, and they had rewarded me with a calculated destruction. The dock felt colder than it had 3 weeks ago, or maybe the chill was just radiating from my own bones. I sat on the edge of the weathered timber, my bare feet dangling over the black expanse of Douglas Lake. The water was a flat, unblinking eye, reflecting a sliver of moon that looked like a silver bone. There was no wind, just the heavy, humid silence of a Tennessee night, broken only by the low, rhythmic thrum of bullfrogs and the distant, lonely call of a screech owl. I had been sitting here for 2 hours, watching the ripples from a jumping bass fade into nothing, wondering if I was doing the same thing. My hands felt heavy in my lap, useless and empty. I thought about the phone calls Marlene had made, the pitying looks from the women at the church, and the way Aunt Patty had looked at me before she climbed into that car and drove away. Maybe they were right. Maybe I was the one who had twisted the past to fit a story that made me the hero instead of the victim. I spent 3 years changing linens and measuring morphine for a woman who was not my mother, and perhaps the exhaustion had finally eaten through the floor of my sanity. I looked at the dark water, and for a split second I wanted to just let go. I wanted to pack my one small box of stuff, sell this house back to the developer, and find a quiet apartment in a city where no one knew my name or my grandmother's history. I could let Marlene have the victory. I could let the silence win. I leaned back, my hand brushing against the main piling of the dock. My fingers caught on the rough, uneven grain of the wood. W.M plus A.P. I traced the letters in the dark, my thumb memorizing the depth of the grooves. Willa Munn and Andrea Polk. She had carved this herself. She had stood on this very dock, likely with the same humidity sticking to her skin, and she had spent the time to mark this place as ours. She didn't do it for Marlene. She didn't do it for Patty. She did it for the Saturday mornings when we sat here with nothing but 2 fishing poles and the quiet understanding that we were the only ones who truly saw each other. A sudden, sharp warmth flooded my chest, burning through the cold despair that had been settling there all evening. If I walked away now, I wasn't just losing a house. I was helping Marlene erase the only person who had ever loved me without a price tag. If I stayed silent, Willa died a second time. My grandmother had built an arsenal from her deathbed because she knew exactly who her daughter was. She had counted on me being the one to find it. I stood up, my legs shaking but my jaw tight. I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed a number I had memorized but hadn't dared to use since the betrayal. "Neva," I said when the old woman answered on the 3rd ring. Her voice was scratchy and alert, as if she had been sitting by the phone waiting for me to wake up. "I am ready, Neva. I am ready for whatever she left you." The next morning I was sitting at Neva Cobb's kitchen table. The formica top was worn smooth, patterned with faded grey boomerangs that looked like they belonged in 1955. Neva didn't say much, as she set a wooden box on the table between us. It was made of cedar, the red grain still vibrant, and it had a small brass latch that had turned a dull dark brown with age. Willa's initials W.J.M were burned into the lid with a steady hand. She gave me this the year before she passed. Neva told me, her eyes fixed on the box as if it were a living thing. She told me that if you ever came home, truly came home, I was to give it to you. I asked her what she meant by that. Willa just smiled that small, tired smile of hers and said, "You would know when you needed it." I opened the latch. The smell of cedar and old paper filled the small kitchen, a scent so thick it felt like Willa was standing right behind my shoulder. Inside, tucked neatly into the velvet lining, was a legal envelope. I pulled out the document and felt my breath hitch. It was a second copy of the will. It was identical to the one I had found behind the cabinet, the same bequeathment, the same date, but the notary stamp at the bottom was different. This one had been signed and sealed by a woman named Helen Jarvis. Willa had it notarized twice, I whispered, the realization hitting me like a physical blow. She went to 2 different people on the same day. She knew one might get lost or stolen, Neva said, nodding slowly. She was a woman who always kept a spare key and a spare plan. I dug deeper into the box. Under the envelope was a small brass key with a blue plastic tag labelled Safe Deposit Box 117 First Bank of Dandridge. And at the very bottom lay a small leather-bound notebook. I opened the first page and saw Willa's handwriting, small and cramped but legible. It was a journal. It wasn't a diary of her days. It was a record of her daughter's greed. Marlene came today, the first entry read, dated 4 years before Willa died. She wants the deed. She says Andrea doesn't need a house because she will marry a man who will provide. She told me I was being an old fool. When I told her no, she didn't come back for 6 months. I am starting to be afraid of what she will do when I am not here to say no anymore. I flipped through the pages, my heart aching with every word. Willa had documented every demand for money, every threat of being put in a nursing home, and every moment Marlene had tried to coerce her into changing her will. It was a roadmap of financial abuse written by a woman who was trapped in her own failing body but determined to protect her legacy. She stopped it from here, I told Neva, clutching the journal to my chest. She couldn't fight Marlene while she was alive, but she made sure I could. I met Vern Pruitt at the First Bank of Dandridge that afternoon. The bank was an old, stately building with marble floors that echoed every footfall, and a teller who looked like she had been there since the bank opened. Vern looked at the second copy of the will and the safe deposit key, his eyes widening behind his glasses. We were led back to the vault, a massive steel room that felt like a sanctuary. The bank officer turned his key, and I turned mine. Safe Deposit Box 117 slid out with a metallic scrape that sounded like a victory. Inside was a third copy of the will, also bearing Helen Jarvis's notary stamp, and a stack of trust documents, showing every deposit Willa had made into the $50,000 account. Vern picked up his phone and began pacing the small private room they had given us, his voice low and urgent as he talked to the county clerk's office. Helen Jarvis, Vern said after he hung up, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. She is retired now, living in Sevierville. She is 81 years old, but the clerk says she is sharp as a tack and still keeps all her old ledgers in her basement. She remembers your grandmother, Andi. She remembers the day Willa Munn walked into her office and asked her to notarize a will that left a lake house to her granddaughter. Because she didn't trust her own daughter, to be honest. She is alive, I said, the weight in my chest finally lifting. We have a living witness. We have a living witness, 3 notarized copies, a journal documenting motive and coercion, and bank records showing exactly when your mother closed a trust that she had no legal right to touch. Vern said, gathering the papers with a new energy. Eckert's motion to dismiss is dead. We are filing an amended petition tonight. I sat in Vern's car for a long time after he left, the safe deposit box key still pressed into my palm. I looked at the bank, then down at the cedar box in my lap. Willa had seen 15 years into the future. She had known I would be exhausted, that I would be alone, and that I would be facing a woman who was a master of the lie. She hadn't just left me a house. She had left me a shield. The drive back to Douglas Lake felt different. I passed Neva's house and saw her sitting on the porch. She raised her hand in a small, quiet salute, and I nodded back. I wasn't just a caregiver anymore. I wasn't the daughter who did what she was told. I was the granddaughter of Willa Munn, and the war was finally moving out of the shadows and into the light. The dead hand was reaching out from 18 years ago, and it was finally time to settle the score. I walked into the lake house and didn't flinch at the smell of white diamonds. The perfume was still heavy in the rooms, but it had lost its power. I walked through the kitchen, past the basement door, and out onto the dock. The sun was gone, the sky fading into a deep purple bruise over the ridgeline. I knelt down and ran my thumb over the carved initials on the post. W.M plus A.P. I pressed my palm flat against the wood and held it there, feeling the warmth the timber had been storing all day. In 5 days, the whole county would know the truth that my mother had spent 15 years trying to bury. I stood up and looked at the water. For the first time, the quiet of the lake house didn't feel like a waiting room. It felt like a promise. Vern filed the amended petition that evening, attaching the Jarvis affidavit and the bank records. The Jefferson County Probate Court scheduled a hearing for the following Monday. Marlene had been served again, this time with a stack of evidence that couldn't be explained away by a church lady's pity or a counter-narrative of instability. I stood on my dock and watched the sun set the copper light dancing on the water, and I knew that the silence was finally about to be broken. Willa had always told me that the truth was like a bass in a deep lake. You might not see it for a long time, but eventually, it has to come to the surface for air. Monday was the day we were going to bring it into the boat. That night, as I was locking the doors, my phone buzzed with a missed call. The screen said Patty Munn. No voicemail. I stared at the name for a long time, my thumb hovering over the callback button, but I didn't press it. If she had something to say, she could say it to my face. I set the phone on the nightstand and turned out the light, but I did not fall asleep for a long time. Something about the timing of that call 3 days before the hearing sat in the back of my mind like a stone in a shoe. The morning of the hearing, I stood in front of the small mirror in my bedroom and did not recognize the woman looking back. I was wearing a navy blazer I had not touched in years, and my hair was pulled back into the tight, efficient bun of a surgical nurse. My hands were perfectly still. I looked at the jawline that Neva said belonged to my grandmother, and I felt a strange, cold armor settle over my skin. I reached into my pocket and touched the envelope containing the letter Willa had written 18 years ago. I did not need the paper for evidence because Vern had the notarized copies, but I needed the weight of it against my hip. It was my reminder that I was not just fighting for a house or a sum of money. I was fighting for the only person who had ever truly seen me. The Jefferson County Courthouse was a stately limestone building that smelled of floor wax, old carpet, and the stale coffee the clerk kept in a thermos behind the bench. It was a small room, more like a library than the courtrooms on television, which made every sound feel amplified. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed with a low, persistent vibration that I could feel in the roots of my teeth. Marlene was already there when I walked in, sitting across the aisle in her best Sunday pearls and a dress that screamed of manufactured grief. She looked like a woman who had practiced her sigh in a mirror for 3 days. Beside her sat Clint Eckert, a man who looked like he was made of sharp angles and expensive wool. He didn't look at me. He was too busy looking at his briefcase. Judge Harlan Tuttle entered the room with the slow, rhythmic gait of a man who had seen every family feud in the county for the last 22 years. He had silver hair and a face that looked like it had been carved from Tennessee oak. He knew Vern. He knew the Pruitt name. He settled behind the bench and looked at us over his glasses with a gaze that felt like a physical weight. Vern stood up and began the presentation of our case with the methodical, unhurried pace of a man who knew he held every card in the deck. He presented the original will I had found behind the cabinet, and then he produced the second copy from the safe deposit box. The room went silent as he played the video deposition of Helen Jarvis. On the screen, the 81-year-old woman sat in her kitchen in Sevierville, her voice thin but sharp as a needle. She told the court she remembered the day Willa Munn walked into her office. She remembered Willa saying she was making 2 copies because she didn't trust her own daughter, to be honest. I watched Marlene out of the corner of my eye. Her fingers were twisting her pearl necklace so tight I thought the string would snap. Judge Tuttle reviewed the bank records next. Vern laid out the paper trail of the $50,000 trust that Marlene had liquidated as the sole heir. He showed the property records and the chain of title that proved Marlene had sold a lake house she never legally owned. Then he began to read from Willa's journal. He read the entry about Marlene screaming at her grandmother over the deed and the way Marlene had tried to force her into a nursing home. In the back of the room, I saw 2 of Marlene's church friends shift in their seats. One of them covered her mouth. The narrative Marlene had spent weeks building was dissolving in the dry air of the courtroom. Clint Eckert tried to argue that the probated will had stood for 15 years and should not be vacated based on a few old notebooks, but Judge Tuttle cut him off with a single look. Vern then stood up and looked toward the back of the room. He said he had one final witness. When the door opened and my Aunt Patty walked in, Marlene's face went the color of a winter sky. She half rose from her chair, her mouth opening to speak, but Judge Tuttle ordered her to remain silent. Patty did not look at her sister. She walked to the witness stand with her head down, her hands trembling as she took the oath. Patty told the truth in a voice that was barely a whisper, but reached every corner of the room. She admitted that she had seen the real will. She admitted that Marlene had practiced our grandmother's signature for weeks at the kitchen table, using tracing paper and old letters. She told the court about the $80,000 wire transfer, the price of her silence that had kept her awake for 15 years. "I'm tired of lying," she said, her voice finally breaking. "Andrea was the only one who loved Mama, and we took everything from her." Judge Tuttle did not take long to deliberate. He spoke with a quiet, devastating finality. He vacated the probate from 15 years ago and admitted Willa's original will as the only valid document. He awarded me the Lakehouse and the $50,000 trust. He ordered Marlene to account for every cent of the unauthorized sale. The judgment was for $530,000 plus 15 years of interest and court costs. Marlene sat motionless as the judge left the bench. Her church friends left the room without a word to her. They didn't even look back. In the hallway after the hearing, Marlene and her lawyer disappeared through a side exit. Vern told me that she would likely lose everything she owned to pay the judgment, and her Social Security would be garnished for the rest of her life. He asked if I wanted to refer the case to the district attorney for criminal forgery charges. I thought about the letter in my pocket. I thought about Willa saying she didn't blame Marlene for her nature. I told Vern no. The judgment was the truth. That was enough. 2 days later, Patty came to Neva's porch where I was sitting. She handed me a cashier's check for $80,000. It was every penny she had left. She told me she had been hearing Willa's voice in her sleep for 15 years, and she just wanted to be able to close her eyes again. I took the check and told her I would speak to Vern about reducing her liability. I did not forgive her, not yet, but I stopped holding my breath when she spoke. Neva sat in her rocker and watched us, saying that Willa always knew Patty was a good woman who had made a very bad decision. 3 weeks later, I stood on the dock as the sun began to set over Douglas Lake. The water turned from a bright gold to a deep burning copper. The smell of pine and lake water was the only thing in the air. Marlene was gone, her perfume and her noise a distant memory. The deed to the house had been amended, and my name was finally where it belonged. I had a part-time job starting at a pediatric clinic in town. I was no longer a ghost in a waiting room. I knelt down on the warm wood of the dock and pulled a small brass plate from my pocket. I had a screwdriver and 4 small screws. I positioned the plate right below the carved initials on the post. Willa's Place, established 1963, the engraving read. I tightened the last screw and ran my thumb over the metal, W.M plus A.P. The initials and the plate were together now. I sat on the edge of the dock and let my feet hang over the water. The silence was still there, but it didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt like an invitation. I realized I had not found peace by running away or staying quiet. I had found it by standing up. I reached into my pocket and felt the crinkle of the letter. "This house was always yours, baby," she had written. "Come home." I looked out at the darkening lake and finally closed my eyes. I was home. The quiet was finally enough.